Pleasure to be here tonight. It's too bad we're not in person yet, but we're going to get there. Let me see if I can bring up my presentation here. Uh, First of all, just thanks to Fresno Audubon, not only for having me tonight, but also over the years, Fresno has provided some of the funds that have helped cover some of the cost of my volunteers, basically their gas money. You're a contributor to this study and conservation effort as well. Um, I am a sort of important, if you will, self-important research associate. I've kind of developed my own little research program on a number of species, bird species that are at risk here in California, primarily in the Central Valley and the foothills. And this is a bird that I got interested in back probably 6, 7 years ago because I had a colony nesting near my family's property in Calaveras County. And I began to see what was going on up in the foothills and felt that the populations in the foothills of the Sierra were not really recognized and appreciated for the contribution that they were making to the tricolored blackbirds ecology and population. So I began studies there. Lowell Young was one who worked with me early on to develop our program. And we've been running this for a number of years. So I will caution you, this is a little bit of data presentation. So it might be a little less visual in terms of pretty pictures and more data and analysis and content, but I'll try to go slow and make sure that people understand. If you do have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, and Robert's going to interrupt me if I become unintelligible, or we can take those comments, questions at the end. So I have a certain theme, but I know an awful lot of other things about tricolored blackbirds, and you're welcome to ask me questions as well. All right, well, let's kick this off then. As I mentioned, this study has been a volunteer citizen science, or I guess they're calling it community science project now. The participants have been California Audubon, who's again funded some of the expenses for our volunteers, the Central Valley Bird Club, of which I'm a pretty active member. We have, I think, at least 6 Audubon chapters that have contributed either amounts of money or volunteers to assist with counting. We've had over 40 different people participate in surveys over the 6 years that we've been working on this. And we published 7 papers, scientific papers, that have included over 20 co-authors on these papers. So I may be saying I did this, I did that, but I apologize in advance because it really is a group effort and I'm kind of the captain, if you will. So a little background first about tricolored blackbirds. I think most of you probably know a fair amount about them, but I think a couple of key facts to remember. One is that it is a species that's nearly endemic to California. That is, it is really characteristic of California. I believe about 98% of the population nests within the state, and there are just a few small populations nesting in Oregon and Washington. They are the most colonial, the most highly colonial of North American birds. And I should qualify that by saying of the extant species, because large birds that occur in large colonies have a tendency to go extinct, such as the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet. So at this point, the tricolored blackbird is the most colonial bird in North America that I'm aware of. And that creates a whole set of interesting conditions in terms of conservation, ecology, genetics, all kinds of things, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then third key fact is that the species was listed as a threatened species in 2018 by the under the California Endangered Species Act. So what are the causes of the decline? Well, you can sort of look at it in the long term and in more recent terms. Over the long term, really the decline began, in the well, certainly it was documented as early as the 1930s, and it probably started well before that, as a result of conversion of natural habitat to agriculture and then subsequently development. So, the tricolored blackbird is adapted. It's a wetland bird that was adapted to nesting in large marshes, feeding there on the abundant insects, as well as in the adjacent grasslands, most of which, of course, were converted to agricultural lands. So that began the big decline. And more recently, we've seen continued decline that has resulted from, I think, really three major causes. The ongoing conversion to development, like here in El Dorado County. That was one of the last colonies that existed in El Dorado County and is now gone. You have conversion of agricultural from open fields to vineyards and woodlands. Vineyards and orchards, which are unsuitable for the bird. And then also the destruction of nests during agricultural harvest, which Rachel mentioned, is going on primarily down in the southern San Joaquin Valley, where the birds are nesting in these agricultural dairy silage crops, and were being harvested with young in the nest, literally tens of thousands of nests being destroyed every year, up until about 5 years when this cooperative effort was put into place. And the last recent cause, which is a little more speculative, but I feel pretty strongly about it, is reduction in food supply due to pesticides. The use of neonicotinoid pesticides, which run off into agricultural, or persist in the soil and run off into agricultural drainages and into wetlands, are suppressing insect populations. And it appears that tricolored blackbirds are not finding enough to eat in a lot of areas as a result. So what is the population status in the foothills? Again, my talk is going to be confined to this foothill region, which I should have mentioned well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead, excuse me. This is the statewide population status here. And this status, these numbers are developed through the triennial statewide survey, again, conducted every 3 years until recently, for pretty obvious reasons. This is a statewide survey that's conducted by large numbers of volunteers who basically scour the countryside and check all previous nesting colonies to determine and count the numbers of birds. And you see here that the population was declining rapidly between 2018 and 2014. It rebounded a little bit in 2017, which coincided with the reduction in this agricultural harvest or destruction of colonies. And so we were hopeful that maybe that we were going to turn the corner and see some more increases. The subsequent survey to 2017 was going to be last year. It was canceled. We were hoping to do it again this year, but we canceled again because we did not have access to some of the federal lands, and the federal employees were not allowed to conduct surveys. And you really can't do a survey like this part ways. You have to do it consistently and cover all areas in order to have a good indication. So perhaps it was stabilizing. We won't know, and next year we'll see. We expect to get back out, and we'll have another data point to track. So my study has been focused again on the Foothill region, which I define as the area on the east side of the Central Valley and the lower portion of the Sierra Nevada range, within which grasslands are the dominant habitat. So we're above the cultivated agriculture, the flat cultivated agricultural lands. And this map here shows you the various habitat conditions within here. And you can see that this green grassland pasture wetlands type is the predominant type in this area. So we're below the woodlands and the chaparral, and we're above the cultivated agriculture, except up in this corner where we took in a fair amount of rice. And sort of once we had this study area established, we've tried to stay pretty true of it. It extends from, as I say here, from Placer County through Sacramento County, El Dorado, Amador, Calaveras, Tuolumne, Stanislaus, and San Joaquin County is within the area, but there are no birds there, as you will see. How do we do this? Well, this is a little different from the statewide survey because we are trying to determine how many birds breed within this region, not just what are the numbers at one point in time, but how many birds breed in this region and where are they and how successful are they and what are they using? So we map the suitable habitat like that map I just showed you. And then we drive roads through that habitat every 7 to 14 days. Now, most of these lands are private, so we don't really have access to them. So we're doing most of this from public roads and in a few cases, parks. We attempt to locate the colonies, which is actually a pretty easy thing to do because when you have large groups of birds like this, you can see them moving back and forth to colonies, even if you can't see the colony itself. We then attempt to access those colonies, estimate the numbers, determine the nesting stages and track that over time, and then determine whether the colonies have been successful. So if you look at it just in terms of area, we annually survey only about 1/3 of the suitable habitat in the study area because that's where the roads are. But I think that we're likely surveying a substantially higher proportion of the habitat that's occupied because the birds spend more time at lower elevation. There are more birds at lower elevations where the ground is flatter and the road density is higher. So I think we're probably surveying more than 50%, but it's hard to derive an exact figure. So this just shows you an example of one year's routes that we cover. Fairly typical. This area in Sacramento County is all urban, so there's no point in surveying it. But we run these areas. We're able to look at basically detect birds out to about a mile from a road if it's not obstructed by vegetation or topography. This also shows you the locations of the colonies, and you can see there's groupings of colonies, and particularly in Sacramento County here and up in Placer County. So how have things fared over time? We started our studies in 2014, and we have recorded between 24 and 29 colonies each year. So the number of colonies is staying fairly steady. The number of breeding individuals is also staying fairly steady. I think that probably the low number in 2014, any of you that have done multi-year surveys know that the first year is kind of a startup year, and you get better at it because you learn more as you proceed through subsequent years. So overall, my read is that both the number of colonies and the number of breeding individuals so far through 2019, the last year that we surveyed, has remained fairly steady in the foothills, which is an important result because, again, during this period, elsewhere in the state, the population was declining. So I think I forgot to mention, but the population in the foothills represents about 40% of the state's nesting population. And how is that distributed? Well, you saw the points previously as to where the colonies are. These bars, it's probably a little too complicated, but each of these bars is 1 year in the study and represents how many birds we saw in each county over each of the 5 years. And really, the results here, simply put, are Placer and Sacramento counties have the highest populations. The population has been eliminated in El Dorado County. We had a few colonies in that Carson Creek drainage south of Folsom and El Dorado Hills, and they developed most of the foraging habitat there, and birds have not been seen there in nesting there in the last 3 years. I checked it last year as well. You note that San Joaquin County has not had any birds, and that's probably due to because that area is where vineyard development has been most prevalent. Stanislaus always has one big group of birds, 7 to 10,000 generally, and then a few smaller colonies. So since I'm talking to you in Fresno, I thought I would mention a little bit about the Southern Sierra foothills. Our coverage there has been incomplete. You know, it's a lot of work to organize all of this and get everybody up and keep them going year after year. And so our coverage has been a little bit spotty in the Southern Sierra foothills. And the numbers there appear to be more variable than in the Central foothills. And I think part of the reason for that is there's less irrigation in the Southern foothills because there's less water. And irrigation, as you'll hear later, irrigated pasture and the presence of some agricultural lands mixed into the grasslands has a beneficial effect, I think. So we have more variation in numbers. The rainfall conditions are also variable, and the foraging habitat and the nesting habitat varies. The primary nesting habitat south of Tuolumne County is milk thistle, and which is a non-native species, of course, and it varies in its growth form and height, and thereby its suitability for the birds from year to year, depending on the rainfall. And sometimes we think based on last year's rainfall determined how much grows the next year because of the amount of mulch or dead material on the ground. So these are the numbers we have for the 3 southern counties. And you can see in Merced County, 2015, we did not have any birds. And then we got a big pulse in 2016, and then it dropped back again. Overall, again, variable, but significant numbers in some years. Another aspect that we've looked closely at is how do the birds move around within this landscape? And one very important component of their biology that has an important implication for conservation is that only about half of the nesting colony sites that were used in 1 year are used the subsequent year. So the birds move around, and the reason for that is that they are highly focused on seeking insect concentrations, and especially grasshoppers, and the concentrations of those insects varies annually based on patterns of rainfall, temperature, and other things. So the birds are essentially flying around through this area, maybe going to their previous colony where they were successful and saying, can we make it here this year or not? And if not, we're going to move on and we're going to look for another concentration. And when they find one, they look for some nesting habitat and they pick it and they nest there. So it's a very dynamic system. And of course, that has major implications for conservation, because you can't just say, okay, birds nested here, let's protect this 10 acres and in perpetuity, and the birds are protected, because next year they may be half a mile away in unprotected habitat and you just spent all your money on a site they may not come back to for 3 or 4 years. So it creates a lot of challenges for conservation. The colony locations and the habitats that are used, as you can kind of see from this map here, most of the colonies are within the areas of extensive grassland. We have a few tucked up into areas with more oak woodland, with rice, but primarily they're in grasslands. Another, you could say, somewhat unfortunate pattern is that oftentimes they're located right near urban areas. And I have a reason for this, but I won't go into it in detail yet. I'll talk later about foraging habitat. Well, maybe I'm going to talk about it right now. So what kind of habitat do they select in this landscape? And again, I know it's a graph. I know some people don't like graphs, but I'm going to try to walk you through it. And I think it's pretty straightforward. What we've done here is we've summarized 3 different scales of habitat in our region. The first one, the gray bar, shows what's the proportion of these various habitat types throughout the whole region, just what's out there. And as you see here, for example, this combination of grassland, irrigated pasture, and wetlands occupies about 58% of the total study area. Then we looked at, well, what are the habitat conditions within 5 kilometers or 3 miles of colonies? Because that would suggest that that's where the birds go to locate. You know, they're picking certain areas out of this whole study area. And that's shown here in this orange. So you can see nearly 70% of the lands within 5 miles, 3 miles or 5 kilometers of colonies is grassland. And then if you look at the yellow one, this is actually, where do we find the birds actually foraging? Where do we see them foraging? And you can see here, 90% of the time or observations are in grasslands. So these birds are selecting for and largely using grasslands out of the suite of habitats that are available to them. And there's a couple of other things that are notable here. Woodland and scrub, you can see they don't select for, they tend to avoid it. That is, they use it less than it's available. Similarly with urban and roads, not surprising. Cropland, however, which are field crops, not orchards and vineyards, they're overusing, they're selecting it. And seed crops, although it's a small proportion of the total area, they're also selecting that type as an area to forage in. So we explored this further. That's what scientists do, you know. And we wanted to look at grid cells to evaluate how does the distribution and amount of habitat affect the density of birds. So before we talked about where are the colonies and what are the conditions around colonies, but colonies are of varied size, and the persistence of colonies in given areas is different. Some, they stay in the same area year after year. Others, even though they may move around a little bit, others, it's very flashy. They come and go. And we wanted to look at how does habitat affect that pattern of density and persistence. So we set up these grids and we characterized the habitat proportions in various density classes. And now I really run the risk of turning you off here, but I'm going to try really hard not to. What this graph shows is these 5 bars represent the various density classes of colonies, or abundance, if you will. So the red bars are where we have the largest numbers of birds breeding annually. And what are the conditions for that 20% of colonies? And then what about the next lower 20%? And all the way down to where we get to sites that are not occupied. So we're measuring the habitat within these 10-kilometer grids, and we're saying, which of those grids do the birds select, and what's the abundance of birds in those relative to the habitat that's available. So the key points here are that the grass, pasture, and wetlands amount are actually pretty similar across all density classes. We don't see a big drop off, and that, you know, it's 90% where they're more abundant. And that was a little bit surprising. What we do see is that the cropland, these are field crops, open field crops, and especially seed crops tend to occur at higher abundance in those grid cells where the birds are most abundant. So that suggests that these two types, seed crops and croplands, may be important components that are supporting higher populations of birds in given areas, even though they don't represent, that much of the landscape. And the reasons for that, if you think about it, make sense, because seed crops are where the adults feed. The adults need carbohydrates. The young need insects. And if the adults are more successful at acquiring carbohydrates more quickly, they can spend more time foraging for insects and feeding insects, which means their nesting success will be higher. So it seems to fit together pretty well. At this point, it's kind of a story. It's not fully proven, but it makes sense. And then you can also notice here that areas that have higher amounts of woodland, shrub, urban, vineyard, they tend to be less occupied. So now we're starting to get a higher landscape feel for where are the areas that are most important to tricolored blackbirds. And I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to kind of demonstrate that. If we look here at what I've called selected land covers. So those are the land covers that the birds preferred. They selected grassland, open croplands, and seed crops in particular. And we ask how many acres of those preferred types occur within these 10-kilometer grids. And then we say, and what proportion of those have active colonies? And what you see is, as the amount of these selected land covers increases here, the proportion, the occupancy of those cells, the rate of occupancy increases dramatically. Again, suggesting, that occupancy as well as abundance is really affected by the composition and the presence of these three favored habitats, which I think is what I just said there. Here's another simple way to look at it. What is the percent of these three selected habitat groups, grassland, seed crop, and field crops, in those colonies at the highest down to the lowest breeding density? And what you see again is not a lot of variation with the density, but importantly, once you drop below 70%, you lose the birds. So an area of 10 square kilometers that has 60% of its area in grassland, seed crops, or field crops does not appear to be sufficient to support colonies. We don't get them. So we really need to be paying attention, to the amount of habitat. And this gives us guidelines for conservation to be able to answer questions like, well, what effect will this project have? Well, you're removing 2,000 acres. That will reduce the amount of suitable habitat by this amount. And we can predict that that could cause the elimination of the species from this particular area. I'm going to turn now to another component of the study, which is actually looking at the impacts of land uses over the study period. And, this is going on every day. I mean, this is not some kind of abstract, theoretical concern. This is what happened over the period we were studying, the 5-year period we were studying. We had 4 colony sites destroyed by mining, aggregate mining. We had 9 sites that were degraded by land use or major loss of foraging habitat. And those activities affected lands that were supporting, in the case of mining, an average of 3,000 nesting birds per year. And in the case of these other degradations, 8,500. So we're talking about, 11,000 birds, 11,000 birds, nesting birds whose habitat was affected. That's 24% of the nesting population and 16% of the colony sites that we found in our study. The silver lining to this is that if you remember back to the graph that I talked about the populations, you remember we have not detected a population decline yet. And so that's a little bit reassuring. But I do want to point out that if we go all the way back to the statewide survey, we saw a 22% increase in the tricolored blackbird population statewide between 2014 and 2017, okay? In our study area, we did not see that increase. I hope I said that correctly. It was a 22% increase from 2014 to 2017 statewide, but in the foothills, we did not have an increase. And it's possible that the lack of that increase was because habitat is limiting now, but that's speculation. And that's something that we may learn as we proceed with our studies this year, because we are going to do the breeding survey this year. We didn't last year, but we will do the breeding survey this year. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to cover here, and I need to go a little quickly, land use protection. This is a big deal, but we evaluated how well our existing land use and conservation efforts protecting tricolored blackbirds based on the information we got, because these conservation measures that have been applied were developed without the level of detail of information that we have generated. So we're sort of testing how well is this working. And the first, we do this through looking at two different sets of land use constraints. One is general plan zoning, and one is the habitat conservation plans that are developed by several counties, which I'll talk more about. For the general plan zoning, we mapped known conservation areas that were already conserved. We acquired data on zoning and permitted uses from the county general plans, and then we classified those land uses to say, what level of conservation protection would this land use provide for tricolored blackbirds? And then we overlaid that protection with the use areas that the tricolors made use of, and looked at, okay, are they well protected or not? We established protection classes like this. I'll go through this quickly, but we had high, moderate, low, and none. High means it's permanently protected lands. So conservation easements, dedicated wildland parks. Moderate is protected through zoning, through agricultural zoning at high parcel sizes or open space. Low is zoning that allows some level of habitat degradation, like orchard or agricultural and rural residential acreages down to 3 to 5 acres. And none is basically incompatible uses, commercial, high density, residential, that sort of thing. And here's what that map looks like. The dark green are protected areas, not very many. The light green, which is the predominant land use or designation, are moderate, are open space lands in agricultural zoning in these general plans. These areas up in here are more subdivided in terms of their zoning, or in the pink case, they're mostly already developed. So that's what the pattern looks like. And again, these little red dots are the colonies. And look where the colonies, many of the colonies are located. They're clustered around these urban areas where the landscape is a little bit fragmented. They're not as common out in these wide open grassland areas. And that, I think, also ties to the idea that they're using a variety of habitats. In these areas, you get a little grain growing, you get a little irrigated pasture, and you get some grassland. And so they have choices of where to feed in these areas, but unfortunately, they're right around the urban areas. So we can look at protection in terms of density, and basically the bottom line here is we are not protecting some of the areas, 20% of the area that is of highest density. The high density colonies are the ones that are most at risk. So that's concerning. Only 10% permanently concerned. As I said, most colonies in agricultural and open space, but 20% have no protection in place. And so, you know, they're ripe for development, and that's what is happening. And as I mentioned, I already mentioned this, so I'll carry on. The second sort of land use restriction that we looked at were the two habitat conservation plans, which have these plans are designed to address endangered species issues under permits to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. So they're meant to allow certain amounts of development to go forward while protecting the species. And the question is, how well are they doing that for the tricolored blackbird? So we looked at these two HCPs, Placer and Sacramento County. I'll start by looking at the Placer site, and there's an array of levels of protection here from least to most. And what you see is, first of all, that we lost a considerable number already during the study, that the areas that are designated for urban growth represent areas occupied by about 6,000 tricolored blackbirds in Placer County. They protect about about 2/3 of the existing population in their conservation areas or existing preserves. It's pretty similar for Sacramento County. They allowed a number to be destroyed. This area, it's got a bad label, but it's urban or protection. So they can choose to protect some and disturb some. So it's really hard to know which areas are going to be affected. But again, about 65% of the population only would be protected under these plans. And is that enough? We don't really know. So I gave you a lot of information, I know, so I'm going to try to run back through the key points and see if I can leave you with something that you can remember from all of these numbers and ideas. First of all, let's just be clear, the Central Foothills are an important area to the tricolored blackbird. And especially in Placer and Sacramento counties. The foothill tricolors require large areas with greater than 70% of the land area in grassland, field crops, seed crops, and I should have added here irrigated pasture or wetlands as well, all fall in that category. Areas with more field and seed crops seem to support higher densities of tricolors. So go plant some oats. Over the 5 years, we lost 5% of the colony sites and 11% were degraded. Only 10% of the occupied habitat is permanently protected. Most of the occupied areas are in ag and open space zoning. So they're temporarily protected until the next zoning changes, you know, some of this to accommodate more development. And of course, that doesn't address conversion of open grasslands and croplands to orchards and vineyards, which is a separate threat. 1/4 of the areas with the highest breeding density at this right now are zoned for development. So they can be developed. They will have mitigation, but the plans do not really do not select mitigation lands with this information in mind. So whether they're going to be successful or not is questionable. So the HCPs could result in a loss that supports about 1/3 of the breeding populations. Lastly, additional work needed, and I'm out of time. I'll just say we need to survey areas that are predicted to be highly suitable, because we haven't been to all these areas, but we can look at them on maps and say, this should be a good area. And we need more surveys to see if birds are there. We need a more fine scale understanding of the role of seed crops and feed crops in tricolor distribution and abundance. We need better mapping of nesting habitat to identify areas that are otherwise suitable, but may be unoccupied due to the lack of nesting habitat, and then we can create it. This was Lowell Young's idea. You know, the nesting habitat can be as little as a 20th of an acre up to an acre and a half with thousands of birds in it, but we can't map that or have not mapped it to date. So we really don't know if there are areas that, boy, if we could plunk down, you know, a half an acre of nesting habitat, we could get 5,000 birds in here. And that could be very valuable from a conservation standpoint. Additional work closely with the Placer County Conservation Plan and the Sac County HCP implementation to mitigate development impacts and ensure that mitigation habitats are actually suitable. And that is the end finally. So I thank you for your attention, and I apologize if I ran on too long. And if we still have time, I can take any questions, which I.
Yeah, we definitely have time for you to take questions, and there's at least 2 or 3 questions down there in the chat box.
Yeah, why don't I see the chat box? My chat box has disappeared. Let me go here.
Granted, I'm on my phone, but mine is in the bottom right corner. Might be different for you if you're on a desktop or a laptop.
Yeah, I'm trying to open things up. Can you just read me the questions? Would that be all right?
Sure, I will.
Sorry,
Let me get into the chat box and I will start. Okay, so we actually have, it looks like there are 3 questions and 2 of them are essentially the same. We have 2 people wondering if one person wrote, I wonder if these facts are similar for red-winged blackbirds, and the other person indicated that they were wondering the same thing. They were wondering, more specifically, if red-winged blackbird habitats are as annually variable.
Well, I haven't studied red-winged blackbirds, but for 2 birds that look so similar, it seems to me you could hardly find 2 birds that do things more differently. You know, red-winged blackbirds are territorial. They spread out across the landscape. They don't cluster. They only occupy, you know, they get their resources from their small territory that they select and defend, while tricolored blackbirds are traveling, you know, up to 3, 4, 5 miles to acquire resources. So yes, I guess the specific answer is that the conditions are variable, and in wet years you have more nesting habitat for redwings and more production of insects, which they use. And so there is annual variability, but I don't think it's as extreme as the tricolor, because they really need these major large concentrations of insects.
Okay. So now our next question, I'll just read this off. Although this is a state threatened species, it sounds like the CEQA process is really failing it. Can you explain why?
Well, you know, much of the impact that we saw, it's just such a complicated question. You know, much of the impact we saw was based on science that was incomplete. And much of it occurred before the species was listed. And so the requirements to deal with it were less. You know, when it was listed, now we have these conservation plans, but the conservation plans were based on old data. You know, those plans took 20 years in some cases to develop, and you know, they're haggling about all the implementation, but the basic data that went into those plans was 20 years old, and a lot of it is obsolete. They're talking, you know, they have colonies in there that were sites that were converted to vineyards years and years and years ago. So the point of this study is to get the information out there and to critique these both general plans and habitat conservation plans, to give planners, environmental community, biologists, everyone the information that they need to improve the implementation of this of these plans. But I'm not sure that fully answers the question because, it's it's complicated. The species biology is complicated, and the world of planning and development doesn't deal well with complicated situations.
We have one more question in the chat box. I'll go ahead and read that one off to you. It's how are we able to participate in these surveys? Do we need permits from CDFW or other agencies? And how do we mitigate our level of take when surveying?
Oh, well, there's no take in surveying. I mean, maybe somebody someday might hit a bird driving, but there's no impact of surveying the birds in my view. I stay away. I don't need to get close in order to count the birds and determine if the colony is active. If I were trying to count the number of young, that could be disturbing, but I don't do that for two reasons. One, you can't get in there because most of these colonies are in blackberries, which is a whole nother story, that most of the colony sites are in non-native Himalayan blackberries, which you can't see the nests and you can't get in there. So that's part of the reason they do well, is because they're so well protected. So you don't have to worry about harming the birds while you're surveying for them, in my opinion, if you just use basic common sense. Then how can you get involved? The statewide survey relies on volunteers, and we have generally a county coordinator in each county. I think in Fresno County, if I remember correctly, it's Jeff, my good friend Jeff.
Jeff Davis.
Jeff Davis, thank you. Senior moment here. And Lowell has been involved in Mariposa County. So at the time that the announcements come out, you can inquire and work with the county coordinator to offer up your services. And I expect that it would be welcome. It takes some training because we want people to know how to do this. You need to learn a little bit to recognize the bird correctly, to estimate numbers and such. But we need more eyes on the ground. Just go out and find birds. So you can definitely get involved, and you'll see notices through Audubon, Cal Audubon, and others when the time comes next year. And if you want to go out this year and look around and send me any records that you have, I'm more than happy to take them. Again, I'm not planning to go south of Tuolumne and northern Stanislaus County this year, but if somebody were really motivated and able to cover more ground further south, I probably couldn't say no.
Awesome. So we have two more questions. One is, first of the two is seeing that there are large gatherings of colonies near urban areas, might there be any similarities to other birds that survive in urban areas now?
Well, the birds are not in urban areas. They're in the outskirts of urban areas. They're in, the ranchette. I mean, they are in open grasslands, definitely, but they're in sort of those ranchette development situations where you may have 5-acre, 10-acre parcels that have a variety of uses going on the different parcels. So that seems to be kind of the sweet spot. And unfortunately, those areas are generally in the path of development. They first they were big parcels, then they got split to 20-acre parcels, then 10-acre parcels, then 5-acre parcels. This is going on right now around me at my family's ranch in Calaveras County. And, eventually you get to the point where the birds can't sustain themselves. There's too much development and not enough suitable habitat. So that's really the challenge. And, we need to start managing more holistically larger areas of grasslands to intersperse them with some of these other habitats that might increase the density. But, we don't own these lands. They're not conservation lands, most of them. They are private farmlands. and ranch lands. And I do want to stress too that, ranchers are our friends. They are not our enemies in this. They're the ones that are providing the habitat. The nesting habitat occurs around ponds, in irrigated pastures, along irrigation ditches. That's where the cattails and the blackberries are growing. And so the ranchers are doing us a huge favor. And one of the things that we could do would be to, develop ways to better support the ranching industry and keep them in business so that these habitats can persist and they don't have to sell out because of taxes or, splitting up of as generations, inherit property and such. Of course, that continues to contribute to the greenhouse gas problem with methane, but you can't do everything. So.
Okay, we have had a few more questions pop up. Let's see, the next one is when the state converts to electric cars, will the lessening of pollutants help the red-winged blackbirds?
My answer is I don't know. I have not seen any evidence that tricolored blackbirds are being affected by pollution other than agricultural pesticides. But, it certainly can't hurt to have, less of this in the field. You do read about birds being, I've seen some things about birds having concentrations that approach dangerous levels in some cases, urban birds, and you have vegetation damage from deposition of pollutants. Actually, in some cases, deposition of pollutants enhances vegetation growth. So I don't think it's a big issue, I think would be my answer for tricolored blackbirds, but I'm in favor of it anyway.
Okay. Our second to last question posed by Lowell Young. Lowell, you asked, is it possible for Fresno Audubon to let people know how and where they can help with the surveys? Now, Dan, you mentioned that our local coordinator or the best person for us to reach out to would be Jeff Davis. Am I correct?
I think so. I mean, I've worked with Jeff on it, and I think he's probably the statewide coordinator. I don't actually conduct that statewide survey. I don't oversee that. But I'm pretty sure he's the local coordinator. So he would
Okay.
be the one to contact, or he'll know who is if he's handed it off to someone else next year. But that would be next year again.
Okay, so reaching out to Jeff Davis then would probably be the best answer for that. Okay, sounds good. Now our last question. There is a plan for a housing development downstream of Bryant, converting pasture land. I have seen no red-winged blackbirds there, but would this be a loss of red-winged blackbird habitat?
I think they're asking about tricolored blackbirds, right? So
I
I'll
assume
answer
so.
that because that's what I'm talking about. It likely would. We did not, again, get that. What county is Bryant in? Does anyone know? Is it?
That would be Fresno County. For the
Fresno?
most part.
Okay. Well, first of all, Jeff would probably know better than me, or possibly Lowell, or several other people that did more on the ground work there. I'm kind of flat out doing Tuolumne, Calaveras, Amador, Sacramento, and this year even Placer counties. So I'm not going to get down there. I don't know it as well. But if you tell me there's irrigated pasture, at lowlands, and there's some nesting habitat around, yes, it's probably occupied by tricolored blackbirds, at least in some years. So it could very well have an effect, and somebody should be looking at it.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions, and it is 8 o'clock on the nose. So we're going to go ahead and close out for tonight. Thank you again, Dan, for the wonderful and highly informative presentation. That was great, to say the least. And thank you to everyone who attended. We absolutely appreciate that. Just a quick reminder, if you are not already, please follow Fresno Audubon on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. We've also relaunched our YouTube channel, and we record these presentations and we do post them on there. So if you were to miss one of these general meetings, you can always catch it on YouTube later, or if by chance you wanted to rewatch one, you can certainly check it out there. So these are, following us on social media, great ways to stay informed about upcoming events, and of course, we're at field trips and volunteer opportunities. And of course, we're always posting fun and educational content. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great remainder of your week. Stay safe out there, everybody.
Rachel, can I make one last little plug? First of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody. You know, the real species that I work on is the Tricolored Blackbird. And I've been doing that for 20 years. And I'm just making a shameless plug here. I have published a book on my 20 years of studies on the purple martin in the urban Sacramento area. And if anyone's interested, it is available at the Central Valley Bird Club website. And I've got 150 copies sitting in my office I need to get rid of. All the money that is raised goes to student research scholarships that we're offering through the Bird Club to encourage students to do more research on birds in the Central Valley. So if you have any interest in that, you're welcome to go there and get a copy. All of my papers are on tricolors, and everything else are available online. You can get them, a lot of them through the Central Valley Bird Club, CV Birds website, or you can just search for them online. But if you're interested, I didn't really put my email down, but Lowell has it, Robert has it, and you can send me messages if you have any further questions or need anything. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Nancy Gilmore just mentioned the chat box that we can provide links and follow-up email. So if you want to provide us links to the Central Valley Bird Club, or more specifically where people can purchase the book.
Sure.
Oh, and also someone just mentioned that your email is on the first slide. So if anyone wants to get his email, you can certainly check out this presentation again and get that information there. But as Nancy mentioned, we'll also be providing links in the follow-up email.